You know, usually when we talk about a courtroom verdict, there's this expectation of mathematical fairness.
Yeah, you sort of picture a set of scales.
Right. You put the good deeds on the right side, the bad deeds on the left side, and the judge just leans over the bench, points to whichever side is heavier, and hands down the result.
It feels very transactional. I mean, if I do enough good, I buy my freedom.
It is a clean, predictable equation. And, well, we like that. We like things to be earned, to be merited. It gives us a sense of control over our own destiny.
But then you step into the theology of the Apostle Paul, and suddenly that scale is thrown out the window entirely. We are looking at a legal landscape that honestly shatters our standard human logic.
It really upends everything. And that shattered logic is what we are looking at today. Welcome to Reformed Thinking.
It is great to be here.
Today, our mission for this deep dive into the source material is massive. We are unpacking R.C.H. Lenski's highly detailed commentary on the first chapter of Paul's Epistle to the Romans.
Yes, and we are going to analyze the text to understand the precise mechanics of justification by faith, the absolute necessity of God's grace, and the stark reality of human rebellion.
For you listening, whether you are brushing up on your theology or encountering this level of exegesis for the first time, this text is the bedrock of Reformed theology. It lays the groundwork for the Westminster Confession.
And it really shapes our understanding of how God actually declares sinners righteous.
I'm so looking forward to this. I mean, Lenski brings a microscopic level of attention to the original Koine Greek text.
He really does. He synthesizes dense theological concepts just by looking at the specific grammar Paul uses. We're going to see how precision in language leads to precision in doctrine.
Right, and Paul is writing to the Christians in Rome, the very center of the known world, the epicenter of political and military dominance.
Which is a huge detail. When you are writing a letter to the capital of the world, especially when you're about to deliver a theological argument that dismantles human pride, you have to establish your credentials.
You definitely have to tell them who you are and by what authority you are speaking. But Paul does something surprising right out of the gate.
He really does. He starts his introduction by calling himself a slave, a doulos of Jesus Christ.
He puts that identity before his official title of apostle.
The word doulos is fascinating here. It indicates total ownership. Paul was purchased.
So a slave is wholly subject to his master and has no independent will except the master's will.
Precisely. By using this word first, Paul does not introduce himself from a high, untouchable pedestal. He puts himself right beside all the Roman believers.
Wow, yeah. He is a brother to them, a fellow slave, before he is an apostle to them.
It makes me think of an ambassador from a foreign nation. If a high-ranking ambassador walks into a room full of expatriates and introduces himself simply as a fellow citizen of their home country, he builds an instant bridge.
Oh, that is a great analogy.
Mm-hmm.
He is looking at them and saying, well, before we talk about my diplomatic credentials, we share the same allegiance. It levels the playing field.
It really does.
Yeah.
And once he establishes that shared allegiance to Christ, he immediately grounds his message in history.
Paul mentions that the gospel was promised in advance through the prophets in early writings.
Now, Lenski stops here to look closely at the Greek preposition dia, which translates to through.
Why does a single preposition matter so much?
Because it defines the mechanics of how the Bible was written. God used the prophets as mediums.
So the prophets did not just get a vague spiritual impression and then sit down to write out their own human ideas about God?
No, not at all. God did the promising, and the actual words came through the prophets.
Ah, I see.
Lenski argues this is a clear, undeniable case for verbal inspiration. God enabled these men to transmit his words specifically as he wanted them transmitted.
So they were not mindless typewriters, but the output was entirely divine.
Right. So Paul is basically saying, I am a slave to Christ, and the message I am bringing you is the strict fulfillment of what God spoke through the prophets.
Then he moves into describing Christ himself, laying out two distinct states of Jesus' existence.
Yes. First, he describes the state of humiliation, where Christ is a descendant of David according to the flesh.
And second, the state of exaltation, where he is declared the Son of God in omnipotence according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection.
We need to look closely at that phrase, Spirit of holiness, because it trips up a lot of readers.
Yeah, I have seen a lot of debate on that. Many older commentaries try to say this refers to the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit.
Right. And others argue it refers exclusively to Christ's divine nature. But Lenski looks at the parallel structure Paul is building.
How does that structure work?
Well, Christ came from David's seed according to the flesh, meaning his human nature in its lowliness and weakness.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then he was ordained as God's son in might according to the Spirit of holiness.
So Lenski interprets this as referring to the holy obedience Christ rendered in his human nature.
Yes, from his conception all the way to his death on the cross. Because of that perfect, unstained obedience, God exalted him through the resurrection.
That sets up the theological framework beautifully. Because Christ rendered perfect obedience, Paul now has a specific objective for his apostleship.
He says his goal is to bring about the obedience of faith among all nations.
But Lenski is adamant that obedience of faith is a single concept.
Right, it is a compound idea, not two separate actions.
Why does Lenski stress that obedience of faith is a single concept rather than two separate actions?
This is where we hit the core of Reformed theology. Faith itself is the obedience God requires.
So it is not a two-step process where you believe the facts of the gospel first, and then later you add your own moral obedience to it in order to finally satisfy God.
No, the gospel calls on you to acknowledge and appropriate it. Doing that, trusting the promise, is the essential act of submission. It is entirely non-synergistic.
Wait, hold on. If God is the one doing the saving, and faith itself is the only required obedience, but we also believe that faith is a gift from God, doesn't that make us just robots?
That is a very common reaction.
I mean, if faith is entirely an operation of God, where is human agency? How does Lenski counter the argument that this turns humans into unthinking machines?
That is the classic objection. Lenski tackles it by looking at the nature of the gospel itself. God does not force compliance like a programmer typing code into a machine.
So how does he do it?
He uses a means of grace, the word. When the gospel is proclaimed, it carries the Holy Spirit's efficacy within it.
Oh, I see. It works on the human will, illuminating the darkened mind and softening the hard heart.
Exactly. You are not a robot. You are a corpse being resurrected.
A dead man doesn't cooperate in his own resurrection.
Right. But once he is made alive, he breathes, he sees, he believes. The faith is your active trusting, but the generation of that faith is 100% God's work.
So you are entirely passive in your justification, but you are highly active in the trusting that flows from it.
Yes, that is a massive distinction. You are not a robot. You are a corpse being given breath.
And once Paul lays out this grand, sweeping introduction, he shifts his tone.
He does. He moves from high theology to intense personal affection.
He has never been to Rome. He did not plant this church. Yet he thanks God that their faith is proclaimed in the whole world.
You have to appreciate the historical context here. The fact that a congregation of believers flourished in the very capital of the pagan empire, right under the nose of Caesar, was incredible news.
It must have encouraged Christians everywhere.
Absolutely. Paul tells them he unceasingly makes mention of them in his prayers, always asking if somehow, in the will of God, he will finally get to visit them.
He says he wants to impart some spiritual gift to them, but he uses a very specific word to describe his goal, some parakothenai.
Yes, which means to be jointly comforted. This highlights a beautiful humility in the apostle.
He intends to strengthen them with his apostolic teaching, but he fully expects that their faith will also strengthen him.
The comfort is mutual. The Greek prefix "in" implies together with. He is looking forward to the cheering mutual contact of their faith and his own.
But Paul also reveals another motivation for wanting to visit Rome. He describes himself as a debtor to both Greeks and barbarians, to both the wise and the foolish.
He says he owes them the gospel, and he intends to reap some fruit in Rome just as he has in other places.
Now, usually, paying off a debt leaves a person with less. You empty your bank account to pay off a mortgage, and your net worth goes down.
That is usually how it works, yes.
But Paul's apostolic debt leaves him richer in fruit. How does that paradox work?
This brings us to the economy of grace, which operates on a totally different ledger than human finances.
Okay, break that down for us.
Paul's obligation, his debt, was placed on him by Christ on the road to Damascus. He was commissioned to preach to the Gentiles. Woe to him if he does not preach the gospel.
But paying this specific debt does not bankrupt him.
No, delivering the message fulfills his obligation while simultaneously gathering souls. Those souls are the fruit which enriches the global church and brings immense joy to the apostle himself.
And it is interesting how he views the audience in Rome. To the rest of the world, Rome was the absolute pinnacle of human civilization, culture, and dominance.
But Lenski points out that to Paul, Rome was simply another field of human souls.
He divides them into the exact same two categories found everywhere else on earth: the cultured Greeks and the uncultured barbarians, the wise and the foolish.
Paul strips away the imperial mystique. He knows that a Roman senator and a barbarian slave share the exact same terminal disease, and they desperately need the exact same cure.
Which brings us to the moment Paul drops the thesis statement of his entire letter. He knows he is holding on to a message that completely upends all of that cultural arrogance.
He is looking at this massive, intimidating empire, and he writes, "I am not ashamed of the gospel."
Which is a brilliant use of litos, a deliberate understatement.
You're right. Paul is actually immensely proud of the gospel. When you consider Paul, a provincial Jewish man from Tarsus, bringing a message about a crucified carpenter to the center of global dominance, the natural human response would be hesitation or embarrassment.
But Paul towers above Rome's grandeur because he knows what the gospel actually is. It is not just a philosophy. It is God's saving strength.
He calls it God's saving strength for everyone believing, to the Jew first and also to the Greek.
Now, people often get confused by the word first there.
Mm-hmm.
Is he talking about a chronological timeline?
Lenski is quick to correct that misconception. The word first here, proton in Greek, is comparative, not strictly temporal.
So it is not about a timeline where Jews get the gospel for a few years and then Gentiles finally get a turn.
Not at all. Paul is singling out the two highest classes of people in his cultural context.
The Jew, who possesses the Old Testament law and the covenants, and the Greek, who possesses high cultural philosophy and worldly wisdom.
Yes. Paul is saying that even the most elevated, privileged humans have absolutely no advantage when it comes to salvation. They need the gospel just as much as anyone else.
And they access it the exact same way, by believing.
And then we hit the absolute core of our Reformed faith. This is the verse that started the Reformation.
Paul says that in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. The Greek phrase is dikaios theo. We view this as a forensic judicial verdict.
It is entirely fatal to Christian doctrine to eliminate the forensic idea from this word. By his verdict, God, the judge in heaven, pronounces the believer righteous.
He places the believer into the status of righteousness.
This has nothing to do with our internal moral progress. It is not a righteousness that we slowly generate over a lifetime of good deeds.
It is God's own perfect righteousness, credited to our account. By his verdict, the instant faith is kindled in us.
This goes back to our courtroom metaphor from the beginning.
It is like a judge's gavel falling. The gavel slams down, and it officially clears a defendant's record, completely disregarding their past crimes.
The record is wiped clean. The person is declared legally innocent, even if they were guilty a second beforehand.
But Paul adds a phrase that trips people up. He says this righteousness is revealed ek pistos is pistin, out of faith unto faith.
Yes, that is a dense phrase.
If faith is just receiving the gavel strike, what does that phrase mean in practice? Lenski strongly guards against any synergism here. How does this align with our Reformed understanding of faith?
Lenski is brilliant on this specific point because he fiercely guards against any creeping synergism. The gospel itself generates the trust it demands.
So when Paul says the revelation occurs out of faith, he means the saving revelation of God's righteousness never occurs unless faith is present.
But as we discussed earlier, that faith is an operation of God. We do not meet God halfway.
God, through the gospel message, creates the faith in our passive hearts. He kindles it.
Then this righteousness is directed unto faith, meaning the verdict is intended solely for the believer to possess.
This seems like a good place to pause and distinguish between objective reconciliation and personal justification, because confusing those two creates massive theological problems.
I agree. The distinction is vital. Objective reconciliation was accomplished historically entirely outside of us at the cross.
When Christ died, the sins of the whole world were paid for. The world was objectively reconciled to God. That is a finished fact.
But personal justification, that forensic verdict of righteous, is applied to the individual only in the instant faith is kindled by the gospel.
No sinner is declared righteous by God, save by faith alone. The cross paid the debt. Faith is the empty hand that receives the receipt.
And Paul backs up this radical claim by quoting the Old Testament. He quotes Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, "The righteous shall live by faith."
He does this to prove that this is not a new invention. The Old Testament saints were saved specifically the same way.
The ancient prophet and the New Testament apostle are in perfect agreement. And notice the sequence of events in that quote.
It is not that a man is pronounced righteous, then he takes a few days to generate faith, and then he finally receives eternal life.
No, all three are simultaneous. The pronouncement, the faith, and the life all happen in the precise same instant and they all come purely from God.
Okay, so Paul has established this glorious mechanism of forensic justification. The gavel falls, and we are saved.
But that naturally begs a massive question.
Right. Why do we need this gavel to fall in the first place? Why is this forensic justification so desperately needed by humanity?
And Paul answers that immediately. Because human beings are facing a catastrophic legal problem, divine wrath.
This is where the text turns very dark, and Paul's diagnosis of the human condition becomes terrifying.
He writes that God's wrath, or Theo, is constantly revealed from heaven against all ungodliness, asabia, and unrighteousness, adikia.
I think when modern people hear the phrase wrath of God, they picture a frustrated deity losing his temper.
Yeah, like a human father who finally snaps after the kids won't stop yelling in the backseat of the car.
Which is a complete misunderstanding of the divine nature.
God's wrath is not a sudden, uncontrolled emotional outburst. It is the constant, settled, unchanging reaction of his absolute holiness to sin.
God cannot tolerate evil any more than light can tolerate darkness. His wrath is the necessary legal response to human rebellion.
And what does that rebellion look like? Paul says that men actively suppress the truth in unrighteousness.
The Greek word kataken means to hold down or suppress. Usually people use the analogy of trying to hold a beach ball underwater.
You push it down, but it keeps wanting to pop up to the surface.
But honestly, looking at the sheer weight of what Paul is describing here, a beach ball feels too innocent.
It really does.
It feels more like a person living in a house where the fire alarm is absolutely blaring, the smoke is filling the room, and instead of running out the front door, this person spends all their energy buying acoustic foam and soundproofing the walls so they can sit on the couch and pretend there is no fire.
Wow, yeah.
It is deliberate, exhausting, and completely self-destructive.
That is a much more accurate picture of the Greek word katachain. The alarm is deafening, but humanity refuses to leave the burning building.
And Lenski frames this as an inescapable either-or proposition based on natural theology.
Because of the things God has made, the visible universe, his invisible attributes, specifically his everlasting might and divinity, are clearly perceived by the human mind.
Men have a natural theology thrust upon them by creation itself. You look at the stars, you look at the complexity of biology, and the fire alarm goes off. There is a creator.
So when confronted with this blaring alarm, what are the options? If creation so clearly points to God, why is the human reaction to suppress it rather than embrace it?
Humans have two choices. They must either abandon their sin and bow to the God who made them, or they must suppress the truth to keep their sin.
Because of total depravity, humanity uniformly chooses the sin. They would rather burn in the house than submit to the owner.
They strangle the disquieting voice of their own conscience because acknowledging God would mean acknowledging his moral authority over their lives.
They want to live however they want, and God's existence is a massive inconvenience to that lifestyle. So they nail the soundproofing to the wall.
Because of this general revelation in nature, Paul concludes that humanity is without excuse.
And Lenski has a very specific linguistic note on the grammar of that phrase, is to being without excuse.
Yes. Some commentators try to soften the blow here by saying God's purpose in creation was to leave men without excuse.
They try to make it sound like a hypothetical legal setup, but Lenski argues the grammar indicates actual result.
It is not just a purpose. It is a historical and present fact.
No man can stand before the judge's bench on the last day and say, well, I lacked the evidence. You hid yourself from me. I needed a sign.
The evidence is overwhelming. The universe itself is the evidence.
But suppressing the truth does not leave the human mind in a neutral state. When you ignore the fire alarm and stay in the burning house, things get messy very quickly.
Paul describes a downward spiral into idolatry. He writes that despite knowing God, humans refuse to glorify him or give him thanks.
Lenski points out that this is a conjunctive or they failed in both categories.
To glorify God is to recognize who he is in his nature. To give thanks is to recognize what he gives to us in his providence.
Humanity refused both acknowledgments. They took the gifts and ignored the giver.
And the result of that refusal is an intellectual collapse. Paul says their reasonings became empty, dileismoi, and their senseless hearts were darkened.
They professed to be wise, but they became utter fools.
When men rationalize away the true God, their reasoning loses its anchor. It reaches no valid goal.
The heart, which in biblical terms is the center of personality, intellect, and will, becomes senseless. It loses actual comprehension of reality.
They boast about their high philosophies, their advanced cultures, but Paul looks at all of it and calls it precisely what it is: silly.
The ultimate silliness is what they trade God for. Paul says they traded the glory of the incorruptible God for image likenesses of corruptible man, birds, four-footed animals, and creeping things.
Think about how absurd that is. It is like a person inheriting a priceless estate, a sprawling mansion with acres of land, and they trade the actual legal deed for a child's crayon drawing of a mud hut.
You look at that transaction and think, how could anyone be so foolish?
The psychology of idolatry that Lenski extracts from the text here is highly revealing.
When humans reject the true creator, they do not actually become atheists in practice.
The human heart is wired for worship. It has to worship something.
So if they reject the creator, they elevate the creature. They fabricate gods that are lower than themselves.
Why? Because a statue of a bird or a creeping thing does not issue moral commands.
Right. It does not demand faith obedience. It doesn't judge you.
By trading the incorruptible God for a corruptible idol, they get a deity they can manage and control.
But they demonstrate the sheer darkness of their own minds in the process.
Which is terrifying. You build a god out of wood so it won't talk back to you. But the story gets even darker.
Because humanity traded the truth for a lie, God responds. But his wrath is manifested here not in fire and brimstone falling from the sky, but in a terrifying judicial abandonment.
3 times in this subsequent section of text, Paul uses the Greek word paradouken. God gave them up.
This is a judicial handing over. It is not just God passively allowing them to wander off into the woods.
It is God, as a righteous judge, actively handing them over to their own self-destruction.
The sinner essentially says, I want my sin more than I want you. God eventually says you may have it, and you will suffer all the inherent consequences that come with it.
The scariest punishment is not a lightning strike. It is God simply taking his hands off the steering wheel, removing his common grace, and letting humanity drive itself off the cliff.
Paul outlines 3 distinct handings over. Let's look at the first one.
God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to uncleanness, dishonoring their own bodies.
Notice the progression. Lenski highlights that God finds them in their internal lusts and hands them over to the external realization of that uncleanness.
They worship the creature, passing right by the Creator, so God let their bodies reflect their internal degradation.
And the second handing over follows right on its heels. God gave them up to passions of dishonor. Females and males exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones.
Now, looking strictly at the text and Lenski's linguistic analysis, Paul points out that these actions carry an inherent physical and mental recompense.
Lenski notes that Paul views these actions as a direct violation of nature itself, a physical aberration.
The text explicitly states that the practitioners receive in themselves the due penalty for their error.
The judgment here is that the sin acts as its own punishment, degrading the individuals who abandon the natural biological order God established in creation.
Then we reach the third handing over, the final stage of the spiral. God gave them up to a reprobate mind, and the document noun.
Because they disapproved of God, God gave them a disapproved mind, a mind that cannot pass a basic moral test.
A mind that cannot distinguish between up and down, right and wrong.
This leads to Paul's famous catalog of 21 vices. Lenski shows how these are organized into 4 rhetorical groups.
Her first, general traits like unrighteousness, wickedness, covetousness, baseness.
Then a group characterized as full of envy, murder, strife, cunning, malevolence.
Then active social destroyers like whisperers, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of cruelties.
Finally, relational breakdowns. Disobedient to parents, senseless, faithless, loveless, merciless.
I want to stop on that list for a second because it is easy to just read past it. You have things like murder, strife, and inventing evil. And right in the middle, Paul lists being disobedient to parents.
That seems like a strange leap.
How do we get from rejecting the creator of the universe to kids disobeying their moms and dads? What is the causal link there?
It makes perfect sense when you understand the mechanics of a reprobate mind. What is a parent?
A parent is the first, most immediate representative of authority and order a human being encounters in life.
When a society collectively decides to suppress the truth of the ultimate authority, God, the entire concept of given authority crumbles.
If the universe is just a cosmic accident and I am my own God, then why should I submit to the man and woman who raised me?
The loss of a transcendent creator dissolves the absolute basis for human empathy, social hierarchy, and family order.
Lenski argues that these vices are not random. They are the logical, inescapable outworking of a mind that has severed its connection to reality.
When you reject the truth at the top, the rot spreads all the way down to the dinner table.
That is incredibly sobering. When the mind is reprobate, the ties that bind humanity together, truth, mercy, family structure, they dissolve completely.
And then Paul delivers the final crushing blow. He writes about the ultimate level of guilt.
These people know God's righteous ordinance, his dikaioma, that such actions deserve death. Yet they not only commit these acts, they applaud others who do them.
If doing the evil is bad enough, what is the significance of the final verse where Paul highlights that people applaud the practitioners of evil?
The applause validates the sin. It represents the final, most hardened layer of a callous conscience.
The sinner at this stage is not just failing through weakness. They are not momentarily slipping into temptation and feeling remorse afterward.
They are actively organizing a rebellion. By applauding others, they seek solidarity in their rejection of God's legal ordinance.
They are building a community of rebellion to insulate themselves from the dread of divine justice.
If everyone is doing it and everyone is cheering for it, they can temporarily convince themselves that the fire alarm isn't actually ringing.
Exactly. I mean, absolutely. It is a desperate coping mechanism.
Okay, let's pull all of this together. If you are listening to this on your commute or while you are working around the house, you might be feeling the sheer weight of what we just covered.
We started at the absolute heights of God's forensic justification.
The glorious reality that God, the judge, declares the sinner righteous through the non-synergistic gift of faith.
The gavel falls, and our record is wiped clean by Christ's obedience.
But then we stared straight into the abyss of human depravity. We saw how humanity suppresses the truth, trading the majesty of the Creator for the absurdity of idols.
And we saw the terrifying consequence, God's judicial abandonment, the removal of his restraining grace, leading to a reprobate mind and a society that claps for its own destruction.
It is a dark, devastating diagnosis of the human condition.
But it is precisely this darkness that makes the light of the gospel so necessary. If we are completely incapable of producing our own righteousness, if our natural, total inclination is to suppress the truth and run further into the burning building, then a righteousness that comes entirely from God, out of faith unto faith, is our only hope.
Lenski's rigorous attention to the text shows us that Paul leaves absolutely no room for human boasting. Every single part of salvation must be an act of divine grace, because humans bring nothing to the table but their sin.
And as we close, we want to leave you with something to consider. We spent a lot of time talking about natural theology and the evidence of creation.
Lenski notes throughout this commentary that the entire visible creation stands as a constant, inescapable witness to God's nature. His everlasting might and divinity are on display every single second of the day.
Which leaves you with a pressing question for your own life. Does your daily routine numb you to this physical reality?
As you go to work, as you walk outside, do you just see background scenery?
Or do you view every sunrise, every thunderstorm, and every single law of physics as an active, unavoidable legal summons from the Creator, calling you to the obedience of faith?
Because that is the reality Paul presents. Creation is not just a backdrop, it is a testimony.
It really is.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source material. We will see you next time on Reformed Thinking.